Dublin was once a city renowned for its street characters. In a time before the concrete and glass cages that sprang up during the boom, a walk through the city streets was likely to result in an encounter with one of the capital's many street legends. From the pioneering Zosimus, also known as the blind bard of the Liberties, who recited poetry to the inhabitants of Dublin in the 1840s, to Harry Lemon, a city dog catcher with a round stubbly face and yellow complexion, to Johnny Fortycoats, who lived on the streets and wrapped himself in a thick layer of coats to keep out the bone-chilling cold of the Dublin paving slabs on which he slept. Few of these characters, however, could claim to be more famous than Bang Bang, who became renowned in the 1950s and 60s for his playful shootouts on the streets of Dublin. "Bang Bang, you're shot. If you don't die, I'm not playing." Jumping on buses and trams, armed with a large church key as his imaginary Colt 45, Bang Bang would shoot his victims, who often played along and fell down dead on the spot. For a few moments of childish joy, a Dublin bus was transformed into a stagecoach from a cowboy film, and instead of John Wayne, Thomas Dudley played the starring role. Businessmen, Gardaí, unsuspecting American tourists, and groups of children could be seen playing along in these mock shootouts, while the few that did not understand what was happening stared on in bemusement. Thomas Dudley, or Lord Dudley as he liked to introduce himself, was a beloved character on the streets of Dublin, and his place in the folklore of the city has been firmly cemented. This video tells his story from his birth in the Rotunda Hospital and the tenements of early 1900s Dublin, a childhood spent in a Cabra orphanage, to his beloved home in the Liberties, how his eccentric and playful antics earned him a place in the hearts of those he shot, and the search for his final resting place and his famous Colt 45. On the 13th of February 1906, Thomas Dudley was born in the Rotunda Hospital on Dublin's Parnell Square, a short distance from O'Connell Street, the city's main thoroughfare and the scene of some of his future adventures. At the time of his birth, Dublin was a notoriously deprived and dirty city. Illnesses such as typhoid and tuberculosis were widespread, and across the city families struggled to eke out a living in decrepit townhouses and rows of damp and mouldy cottages hidden in dingy courtyards. Many of the fine Georgian houses that Dublin is famous for had been abandoned by their wealthy owners, who moved en masse to the leafy green suburbs. Unscrupulous landlords saw an opportunity to profit from the working class people of Dublin, as they rented out the former townhouses to multiple families and allowed the buildings to decay around them, as they pocketed the rent of those who had nowhere else to turn and lived with the ever-present threat of the workhouse. This was the Dublin that Thomas was born into in 1906, when his parents, 34-year-old John Dudley and 24-year-old Mary Dudley, lived in a shabby tenement building they shared with three other families at number 30 Clarence Street North in the parish of St. Thomas. One of the first records we have of Thomas Dudley is in the 1911 census, when he was 5 years old and living with his parents and younger sister Mary Ann on Clarence Street North, close to Summerhill, on the north side of the city. John's profession is listed as a chimney cleaner, who the census shows is able to read and write, while his mother Mary cannot. Dudley is an uncommon name in Dublin, so we can easily track down John in the 1901 census, a decade before, when he was living at number 34 Cuff Street, again shared with four other families, with his aunt and uncle, and was already working as a chimney cleaner. Mary, whose maiden name was Kane, is a bit more difficult to trace in the census, as there are 86 Mary Canes living in Dublin in 1901, 5 of whom are the same age. Details of Thomas Dudley's early life are relatively few. His father John died in 1913, aged 36, when Thomas was just 7 years old, and his mother Mary then moved to a house on Kevin Street where she worked as a servant, but she too would die prematurely a few years later. The harsh conditions of tenement life curtailed both of their lives. Shortly after the census of 1911 was compiled, Thomas was sent to live in St. Vincent's Home, Cabra, run by the Sisters of Charity. He didn't receive much of an education with the nuns and was held back from progressing to second class, but did recall the duties given to him by Sister Cecilia, which included ringing the bell from the top of the school steps at 9:30 every morning. While living in the orphanage, Thomas sustained an injury to his eyes after he was hit by a schlitter. This injury would greatly impact his life as he grew older. As for his younger sister, Mary Ann, little is known about her life after the death of her parents, but it seems likely that she too was sent to an orphanage. It seems that from an early age, Thomas Dudley was a very independent person, and at the first opportunity he found, he left the orphanage and took to the streets of Dublin. He began working as a kitchen porter in the Rialto Tuberculosis Hospital in the grounds of St. James's Hospital, and for a time lived in the Dublin South Union, also known as the Workhouse. While working in the kitchens, his responsibilities included making beef tea, a staple food of Victorian hospitals for people who had difficulty eating and digesting solid food, that was made from boiling diced beef in water, and also large pots of porridge for the patients. At some stage he decided that this job was not for him, and instead began a lifetime of wandering the streets of the capital city. Although Thomas was now an adult, he remained young in both heart and mind, and never really grew up. For a time he moved around the city and lived in places that were familiar to him, such as Summerhill and Kevin Street, but would eventually settle in the Liberties, where he found a home and a community that accepted his eccentric ways. A ground floor flat at number 9 Mill Lane, next to Newmarket, became Thomas's home, where he spent the majority of his life. His living conditions were poor, to say the least. Using old potato sacks in lieu of bed sheets, the building in which he lived was damp and prone to rodent infestation. Despite these challenges, Thomas's years in the Liberties would be the happiest of his life. While living in Mill Lane, he began his famous shooting career sometime around 1946 and enjoyed the independence his little flat offered and the friendship of his neighbours. He gave a description of his daily routine to a friend who recorded it as thus: "I'm not a big eater, make a nice sup of tea, you know. I would smoke a cigarette and then I'd sit down. A slice of bread and butter. I never eat jam. I'd never eat fruit, but I will tell you what I like. Fish. I like fish. I love fish." For dinner he usually boiled potatoes, cabbage and bacon on a lovely fire grate in 3 lovely clean pots. For his provisions of woodbines, tea and sugar, bread and butter, etc., he went to Brennan's in Mead Street facing the chapel. Of course I paid the money down. She said to me, bang, "If you're ever short of money, just come in and ask for anything you want. You don't need to be short." On cold winter nights, Thomas would sometimes take in a passing stray dog for company and to keep them warm by the fire. I was down in Mill Lane on a cold, frosty night. I would have the fire on and a dog passed by lost, you know, and he'd come over to me. When I was going into the room, he followed me in. He'd get the smell of the heat off the fire. I knew he would want shelter. so I put down a few sacks for him to lie on that and give him a sup of whatever I had in the pot. Thomas would often visit some of Dublin's many cinemas, where he fell in love with the cowboy films that inspired his own shootouts. John Wayne was his favourite star, and his action-packed shootouts in the Wild West of America, jumping from horseback to stagecoach, sparked an idea in Thomas's mind. Dublin may not have stagecoaches anymore, but it does have trams and buses with an open back door. He acquired a large key, thought to be from an old church door, and set about becoming the John Wayne of Dublin City. Queuing outside the cinema with the droves of kids who shared his love for cowboy films, a shootout began. Bang bang, bang bang! Some kids fell down while others returned fire. A passing tram caught his eye and he made a leap through the open door, continuing to fire from his Colt 45 on both the kids and now the passengers on the tram. The year was 1946 and the Dublin legend of Bang Bang was born. The trams would soon disappear from the streets to be replaced by buses, and while walking through any part of the city, you are liable to be the victim of a drive-by shooting by a man with jet black hair, wearing a suit and a hat, while hanging out the back of a passing bus. He became a favourite of kids in the city centre who actively sought him out to have a shootout on the way home from school. In his essay Bang Bang, published in 1984, Bernard Neary described the scenes as follows. He began his shooting career on the trams and then took to the open-back buses. Tommy Thornton of CIE's Broadstone Depot as a conductor on the number 12 tram route, and from 1949 to 1965 as a conductor on the number 12 bus, happily recalls Bang Bang's stunts as he regularly jumped onto the back of Tommy's bus in Camden Street when, swinging out of the bar with one hand, he would shoot with his other, in which he held a large key. Other days, however, he would have the look of a desperado about him and would open fire on everyone, being his most active on Camden Street and the Dame Street corner. Bang Bang continued along Dublin's main thoroughfare, O'Connell Street, jumping off at the Rotunda Hospital. After letting loose with some rapid bursts of gunfire, he would return to the south side, generally on a number 12 bus. His most regular run was on the 50, 50A and 54 bus routes. Passengers and public alike loved him, and it was a common sight to see a Garda or businessman return fire with a finger or umbrella. The Garda returning small arms fire from the waist with an index finger, the businessman delivering powerful bursts of submachine gun fire from the umbrella that was held shoulder high. While travelling on the trams and buses, he would occasionally slap his rear end as if on a horse. In his book, Your Dinner's Poured Out, Paddy Crosby gave the following description of a shootout on Marlborough Street. The magic of make-believe childhood took over, and it was all due to the simple innocence of Bang Bang. He was a very young man at this time. Bang, you're shot. If you don't die, I'm not playing. My father was very fond of him, and seemed to come across him very often in different parts of the street. He told us about one incident with Bang Bang in Marlborough Street, where the shooting pretense went on for nearly half an hour, and some visiting Americans joined in. They thought the whole thing was hilarious.
They're not there. I don't live in the room.
While not conducting shootouts in the city centre, Bang Bang could often be found near his home in the Liberties, where he sought refreshment in pubs such as The Clock on Thomas Street. A bottle of stout and a Woodbine cigarette were just what you needed after a hard day of banging. At home on Mill Lane, he often cooked himself a stew or a coddle, or even the beef tea he had learned how to make in the Rialto Hospital. When he didn't feel like cooking, he treated himself to dinner in Woolworth's department store. While in the Liberties, he occasionally could be seen with some of the other characters of Dublin, like Harry Lemon and Johnny Fortycoats, who, according to the great historian Eamon MacThomas, could be seen gathering at the wall of a bakery on Bridgefoot Street. The heat from the bakery ovens apparently passed through the wall and provided some respite from the cold. As the years passed, Bang Bang became a legend on the streets of Dublin, but many of the people he shot would never know his real name. When he got older, he often introduced himself as Lord Dudley. In the early 1970s, the eye injury he suffered while in the orphanage began to cause his eyesight to deteriorate, and he slowly lost the ability to carry out his mock shootouts. He would leave his home in Mill Lane to live in a chalet next to the flats at 50B Bridgefoot Street, a short distance away, that was given to him by the council. His health continued to decline, and following a collapse at home, he was taken to hospital by neighbours and stayed in the Linden Convalescent Home in Stillorgan for several months, suffering from a stomach ulcer. He returned to 50B Bridgefoot Street for several years, but things would never be the same for Thomas. He missed his former home, saying, "I couldn't settle down. I was crying every day, crying when I would wake up in bed. I miss Mill Lane." He eventually settled in Bridgefoot Street with the help of his friendly neighbours and a nurse that visited regularly to check on him. However, the city around him was changing, and the safety and freedom he previously enjoyed seemed to be a thing of the past. A newspaper report tells how he was beaten by a group of youths who stole his transistor radio. While staying on Bridgefoot Street, it appears his generosity was also taken advantage of by another group, who befriended him and used the chalet to store stolen goods. In 1976, as his eyesight continued to worsen, Thomas was moved to a home for the blind in Clonturk House, Drumcondra, run by the Rosminian Fathers. Again, the move proved to be difficult for him, as he longed to return to his home in Mill Lane and the community that he loved. "When I came here, I was dying twice inside of 3 years. Then this year, I was nearly going down again. I went against food. I couldn't eat." While in the home, he was visited frequently by friends including Eamon MacThomas and the occasional journalist. In the quiet evenings in Drumcondra, he was still able to enjoy a bottle of stout and a cigarette before bed. According to Bernard Neary, you could see the faces of visitors and workmen at the home light up when they recognised Bang Bang. On the 12th of January 1981, Thomas Bang Bang Dudley went peacefully to sleep for the last time at the age of nearly 75. The following day, his death was reported in national newspapers and stories of his life were recounted. A few days later, Thomas's funeral was held in the chapel next to Clonturk House, where a quiche-shaped wreath of chrysanthemums was placed next to his coffin. The funeral was attended by about 50 people, including his fellow residents of the Home for the Blind who sat in the front row. Afterwards, the funeral procession made its way through the freezing cold January rain to the small graveyard in the grounds of St. Joseph's Home for the Blind, also run by the Rosminian community, where Thomas Bang Bang Dudley was laid to rest in an unmarked grave. As time moved on and Dublin rapidly changed, Bang Bang lived on in the collective memory of the city, yet his grave remained without a headstone until a campaign organised by the owners of Bang Bang Cafe on Leinster Street North in Phibsborough raised funds for a memorial. At the time of his burial in 1981, the location of his grave was noted by a caretaker, and finally in 2017, a memorial was placed at this spot to mark the grave of one of Dublin's greatest street characters. Today, Bang Bang's memory is preserved for future generations by the stories of the people who knew him as a child and the historians who visited him in Mill Lane, Bridgefoot Street and Drumcondra. He is recalled in poetry and song, including by the Dubliners in the Merrow, as Ronnie Drew sings, "And we all went up to the Merrow, hey there, who's your man? It's only Johnny Fortycoats, sure he's a desperate man. Bang Bang shoots the buses with his golden key." So what became of Bang Bang's key? Does this piece of Dublin street history still exist? While researching this story, I found that the key had been kept at Clonturk House following his death, until it was eventually donated to Dublin City Archives in 2011, and thanks to the kind staff of Dublin Library and Archive on Pearse Street, I was able to see Bang Bang's famous church key, the Colt 45 that featured in his adventures in the streets of Dublin. Thanks for watching Bang Bang's story. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and maybe share it with a friend. There are lots more stories from Dublin's past on the way. If you have any memories of Bang Bang, please share them in the comments below.